Hi there, and welcome to Office Hours for. Ah, Hi there, welcome to Office Hours from Distinctions for Life. I'm your host, Ron Davis. Thank you for tuning in. I began these live streams during the great pandemic of 2020 as a chance to connect with interesting people. There's very little format to these, and their purpose is whatever I want it to be at the time. Today, our guest today is Aaron Frankel. Aaron and I have known each other for a very long time. We've had businesses together, we've worked on various projects together. We taught podcasting in a company called Launchapod for a year or so, and we've both had podcasts. Aaron had a podcast called In the Rabbit Hole, which was an urban survival podcast. And he had this for a number of years. We'll get him to tell us exactly how many years that was, but he had it in one of the interesting tenets and core sort of philosophical beliefs was that skill was as important or more important than knowledge. And when you were preparing for something, the skills that you prepared and knew ahead of time were probably more important than any gear you bought. They were more important than your bug out bag. They were more important than the amount of ammunition that you had stockpiled or how much canned food you had. The knowledge and the skills that you had to practice, those were much more important. And as we are all kind of learning now in an actual, it's not really a survival situation. Let's not go crazy. But it is the pandemic that everybody has been predicting for years. And we're learning all kinds of different things about that. But I wanted to talk about skills versus knowledge with Aaron because of the rabbit hole's focus on skills. And I have this feeling that skills are also very important in business and for entrepreneurs, which I know that Aaron knows a lot about as well. So I'm just gonna welcome Aaron to the show. Hey, Aaron, how you doing?
Hey, Ron. Thanks for the introduction.
Up, can't hear you, Aaron. Oh,
Uh,
yep, yep.
Can
There
you
it
hear me
is.
now?
All right, never mind.
Are
I
we?
can hear you now.
Can you hear me now?
Uh-huh.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Uh, so, Aaron, tell us a little about you. So I just told our origin story, how we met each other, and
Mm.
our relationship, the story of our relationship.
The story of
Uh,
us.
yes. Why don't you give people your version of that as well?
I would say my version of that doesn't differ all that much. I guess one thing, especially these days, someone hears prepper, survivalist, or something like that, they can get hung up on it. I mean, obviously, my life is a lot has included a lot more things than that, and yeah. So, but I'm a wacky person, and I get interested in things and go down rabbit holes. Hence the name of that show, and find that I really like to dive deep into topics, which was also why skills became so important. Because with so many things we do, whether it is survival or whether it's business or whether it's photography or anything, it becomes very easy to just become an information junkie, to purely or even a data junkie is probably a better way of putting it, of just consuming information and data points and never really turning that into knowledge, or even better, wisdom, and actually having a skill at the end of it.
Yeah, and it's one of the things that you really see in survival is people buy all this gear and don't know how to use it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? Like they've never used it, even as basic as a tent. I remember, I think we've had this discussion, you had it on
Yes.
your show, but people, like we're gonna prepare to survive the whatever.
Hmm.
And to do that, we're gonna buy a bunch of camping gear, but we're never gonna go camping.
Yeah.
We're gonna buy a tent, and when we need it, we've never set it up before. And
Hmm.
all it takes is like 5 minutes in your backyard to realize that you don't know how to set that tent up.
Or that there's parts missing, which there is a funny story about that. Years ago, I went camping and we took along a friend of ours that had never been camping before. And he said, "What should I do? What should I take?" And we gave him a fairly organized list of like, "Hey, you don't have to go crazy, but you do need a really good sleeping bag and a really good tent. And other than that, we have everything you need. So maybe a flashlight or something, and we're going to the desert, so pack some light clothes for the day because there's a large temperature variance, and gave him some basics. And then he promptly ignored everything we said. Because one of the things I did warn him about was, or actually it was two things. One, when you go, he was a big guy, like a big bodybuilder guy. And it was like, you're not a normal size and shape. So make sure you go to REI, where they will, or someplace comparable where they will let you try the sleeping bag on. And then I also said, and also when you get a tent, get a decent tent, but make sure you set it up first before we go. And again, he completely ignored, went to the store, bought the cheapest tent he could find, and bought the cheapest sleeping bag he could find without trying it on. So when we got out there, which also happened to be in the middle of the night, he thought that was a good idea, that would be the time he would put his tent together. It turned out he was missing pieces and didn't know what he was doing. And it was too dark for us to really help him because we also didn't know his tent. We knew our own. And then it turned out his sleeping bag did not fit him. So, yeah.
Yeah.
So he
Yeah.
froze his rather large butt off all night, and we had to listen to him complain. And I think that's the problem. And going back to what you were saying about gear, and again, this applies to anything. I think you were in photography for a long time, and a lot of people get interested in photography, and the first thing they do is start buying stuff because, well, I got to have a camera to take pictures with. But that's usually not the best place to start. And I think in a lot of ways, and this is comparable again. People will buy lots of books and maybe they skim them or maybe they just buy them. This was a big thing in the prepper world that drove me nuts, is people would buy these huge libraries and maybe they would read bits and pieces. Maybe they'd take notes. They'd never refer to the notes again. They would never take the data out of the book, the individual facts that they learned, and put them together to form information, and then go take that into the real world, try it, get experience. And so they had knowledge that do it more and maybe turn it into wisdom. And instead, and their answer to everything, well, if I need to know that, it's in my library and I'll just read it when the zombies march. And it's like, well, I don't think that's the way that works, but okay.
Yeah. It's interesting because I've been thinking about this framework, and I've mentioned it before on the live streams. That's Distinctions for Life sort of framework, and it has right now 5, maybe 6 areas. But one of those is knowledge, and one of them is skills. And it's oriented toward entrepreneurs, because I think too often knowledge is so easy. Like, it's so easy to acquire it, that we think that we want to do that. Like, I'll spend tons of times reading books, watching videos on how to do, say, copywriting. Let's use copywriting, because I know
Okay.
you're a copywriter and you know that. Like you can read 100 books on copywriting, and that gives you lots of knowledge, but it doesn't give you any skill. The only way you get skill in copywriting is to write copy. And so, what would you say if A, do you think my dichotomy is correct? And B, how would you define the difference?
No, I think so. It's fairly close. I think if we were going to use to sort of stay in the business world and stay out of the academic world, I mean, it's the definitions I'll give are pretty academic, but to stay out of the like adult education or neuroscience world of that, just to give a simple framework for people to use. So if we have data, and data is just a raw fact. So let's pretend we own a convenience store for a second, and we could use the Loudon and Loudon examples of a convenience store. So data would be, in January, we sold, I don't know, 5 candy bars or something. And then from there, we have information, which is where we take 2 or more data points, combine them together, and that data then becomes meaningful. So we'd say, okay, well, we sold 10 candy bars, and then we also sold, so many other we sold chocolate bars, but we also sold so many other candy bars. And from that, we have the meaning of some sort of comparison of our sales to keep it in the entrepreneurship world. And then from there, knowledge is storing that, just hanging on to it. and maybe applying some experience to it of, well, what happens in this and that. So it's understanding and applying patterns, and then wisdom is really getting out there and understanding like how what is it, when, where, and how to apply the knowledge that we've gained. So that was a really like segmented way of looking at it. But I think it's very easy to accumulate a lot of knowledge. You could read all the books in the world, like you said, on copywriting, and you would have a lot of information, and maybe you played with it a bit, and you turned things into knowledge by fiddling with it a bit. But unless you wrote like every day, and then also went out and got feedback in it, and maybe even split tested, where you gave 50% of an audience one version of copy, and then the other 50% of the audience another version of copy to then understand which one works better, and then afterwards do an analysis to say, okay, well, why did that one work over this one? And I think that's where the skills come in. You really gain that wisdom by applying whatever you've learned about. And I think that's true in business. It's true in self-help. It's true in everything. Self-help is another great one, because a lot of people will read books endlessly, but then they don't do anything with it afterwards. They don't practice it. They don't ingrain it. They don't get the wisdom that comes from experience with it. So having expanded a lot on what you said, but yeah, I mean, I think your dichotomy works pretty well. It's perfect. And I think it's been a pet peeve of mine with whether it's entrepreneurship or anything is, and I think another one that people may understand, and some people this will rub the wrong way, and it should. I was having a conversation recently with another mutual friend of ours, Jonathan, and he's the COO of a great big company, and they're a big tech company and doing really well and everything. And so he's hiring all these MBAs, and he was complaining, like a lot of people in his position do, these damn MBAs don't know anything. And I'm like, well, no, they know a lot. They just don't know what to do with it. And they don't know the when, where, and how to actually apply it. They don't understand the nuance of what they've learned. All they have are some pegs to plug into holes, but they don't know exactly like, this one's a little like this, and this one you kind of have to shimmy like that. So I think those are the things that come into play. And I think MBA is probably one that a lot of people get, and one that gets beat up on a lot, rightfully so.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that one of the things that when I was trying to differentiate the two, and I think it's interesting that you put in wisdom here too. One of the ways that I see a key differentiation between a skill and knowledge, because sometimes they can be really close,
Mm-hmm.
or like you have to have some level of knowledge in order to develop a skill. And after you start developing a skill, gaining some more knowledge may help you develop that skill.
Mm-hmm.
But to me, the core distinction was how you acquire them.
Mm-hmm.
So with knowledge, you acquire that. You can acquire it by study. That's one way of doing it. The other is by experimentation. So you can
Mm-hmm.
try stuff, and get some data back from that, and then try and interpret that data. Interestingly enough, I would say all this interpretation of data is a skill and
Mm-hmm.
not knowledge, right? It's like you can grab all the data in the world, but if you don't know how to interpret that, then it's useless to you,
Mm-hmm.
right? So, but the big difference with a skill is you learn it, you master it by practice,
Mm-hmm.
by repetition and incremental improvement over time. Whereas when it comes to a piece of knowledge, you're not generally incrementing. You're not you can learn more, you can study more, but you're not improving that skill or that ability or whatever you want to call it, um, by uh, by doing that. It's only the skills are learned by the repetition, and obviously there is a connection
Mm-hmm.
between them. There's a connection between all kinds of things in uh, this I don't even know what I'm going to call it yet, framework that I'm working on.
Yeah.
But when it comes to distinction, we very often you get into sort of, okay, is that knowledge? Is that a skill? And my first question is, well, how do you get better at it?
Yeah.
How do you master it?
Well, and I think for me, to go back to, so two examples. One, we can go back to copywriting for a second. Copywriting is a lot like mathematics. It just, you have to do it 5 days a week or 7 if you can. I mean, you just have to keep doing it. It's repetition. And in the same way, a lot of great writers will say the best way to learn to write well is to read the works of others, and you consume so much that you start to see patterns after a while. And it's, that's one part of the experience, and then the other is the doing it over and over. And while you're doing it, I'm going to play with it this way or that, or you one day you interject humor into it, in a in a successful way.
That's right.
And um humor is easy to do in a bad way, but um and then you go, oh, okay, that was interesting, that worked, or people responded to it. And I think that becomes part of the problem with knowledge. You can gain a lot of information and a lot of knowledge, but unless you've really worked at it a lot, there's so much that like books or even mentors can do to impart their knowledge with you. They can't really impart their wisdom well. They can share with you their experiences, but you still have to do your own to be able to interpret it correctly. And I think that's a weird little nugget there that I learned a long time ago is somebody can give you all the information and share the information about their wisdom all day long, but until you've experienced it personally, you're not able to turn that knowledge into wisdom or that knowledge into a skill. Um, Years ago, so when I was really big into the survivalist preparedness stuff and doing the show, which you mentioned earlier, I think the show went on for about 8 years before I
8 years.
finally decided to turn it off, or at least stop making new ones. Um, so one of the things that I wanted to learn was food production. And so studied a lot, read a lot of books, bought a lot of books on all kinds of topics, from aquaponics to raising chickens and raising goats. And I think there was pygmy goats involved in there somewhere at some point. But I ended up landing on rabbits, as trying to figure out a protein source, for when the zombies march. Uh, and um, and it was really funny because you always hear, well, they breed like rabbits. And that was part of the reason that I went that route with them. And I'd read all these books, and I really, like an MBA, thought I knew what I was doing. Went out, bought some rabbits, built these very elaborate cages, did, blueprints and drawings and all kinds of other stuff, and built this rather large, elaborate farm. And then we started working with the rabbits, and it took, you have whatever length of time it takes them to where they're mature, and we have them, and then we start trying to breed them, and it's not working, and it's like, well, this isn't what the book said or what the books said. And we kept working, and then we would finally do something a little bit just slightly different. And then it was, oh, I read this piece of information and I studied it and we've played with it, but now I've actually practiced it and experienced it, and I understand things that I thought they meant this, but they actually meant this. And there was no really good way for the author of those books to have described that subtle difference between the two that actually ended up producing young rabbits or getting the rabbits pregnant. So yeah, I think that's where that distinction comes in. Is it's good to study, it's good to get information. It's better than doing something half-assed and losing a digit or doing something else. But at the end of the day, you do have to get out there and do something with that knowledge, and turn it into a skill, because whatever the book says, you may have interpreted it one way and it may be close, but not exactly the same. And it's those subtle things, or as my mother would say, that pinch of salt that makes the big difference, that actually makes it work.
Yeah, that's another key point there, that one of the things that we can do is get lost in the research,
Hmm.
and then we don't even know what we don't know,
Yeah.
and we think we know, but we don't know, because
Yes.
until you do it, you may not even understand what it was that you were reading.
Hmm.
Um, and that's there's a phrase I like to use, which is that action will teach you like research never can.
Hmm.
That you need to do just enough research that you can start taking action, and then that action will show you what it'll show you all kinds of things, right? But it'll show you what research you actually need to do, not just uh, I'm just going to go and read everything or watch every YouTube video that ever existed on how to make sourdough,
Yeah.
Um, and then, uh, and then when your sourdough, this happened to me this week, says well, my relevant story. I've been growing Tamaguchi. He has a name now. It's my sourdough starter for like a week.
Uh-huh.
And I'm like, okay, he's finally big enough. I'm gonna make bread, and I made this bread, and the bread was just like super sticky. And I was like, I don't even know why this would happen. Why is this thing? Do I need to add what's going on?
Uh,
And so finally, I'm like, internet. Now I'm like, internet. What happens when you're really, really sticky? And they come back and they go, well, what happened was yours is over fermented. The yeast have just gone crazy and they've taken over the whole thing. And this is your toast.
mm.
Most other things you can fix. This you can't fix. Just throw it away. And so that was, but like I would never even have thought about that until I ran into it. And then I'm
Mm.
like, okay, now let's go back and see. And then that showed me a whole bunch of things about how what is going on inside that jar that I didn't know before.
And didn't
And I
know to
can go back
ask.
and learn more. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I know to ask too. That's another thing. You don't even know what to ask.
Yeah.
Uh,
There was a good model for that, or a good way of slicing that up and categorizing. I can't remember. I think it was a neuroscientist I was reading a while back, and they talked about, and I think it's a pretty old model of there's unconscious incompetence. You don't know what you don't
mm,
know,
I've heard
and
that.
then there's conscious incompetence. You have a pretty good idea of what you don't know, and then there's conscious, or then you get to a stage of unconscious competence where you know so much and you've practiced it and have such and turned it into skill and or wisdom that you don't have to think about it anymore. You just know it and you just do it.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's that as well. That as well. Um, well, Aaron, like you're the first one that I've ever like had on the show that we got like 20 minutes in and we covered everything there is to know about this topic.
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah, so we've gone just all the way down into this topic.
So let's talk about a weird sort of content creation question for you. So you had a survival podcast
Hmm.
for, did you just say 8 years? Is that right?
8 years.
8 years, and you stopped putting any new out last May, if I remember right, correct?
I think so. Yeah,
Yeah.
I think that was about
So nothing
when.
new last May, and then we hit the biggest survivally disaster, at least of our generation
Yes.
to get to so far. Um, do you ever wish you still had Rabbit Hole going?
Well, technically, it still lives on without me. It just there's just nothing new on it. I That was sort of one of the promises I made to the audience, and any future listeners, because I think by the time yeah, so I ended on episode number 300. Just and that was kind of I wanted to kind of end the show before that because I was worn out,
Hmm.
and had other things in life I wanted to do. Most people don't realize to really produce a show, how much time it takes. And so, but I was like 300. That's a good round number, so I finished it out there, and I left it all up on both YouTube and Apple, iTunes, and everywhere else that you can get podcasts. To your point, no, no. After 300 episodes, and that was the other reason, the other big reason I felt like I don't need to make this anymore because I just felt like I had said everything that I felt like needed to be said. We could have, I, I to for something that's current. Yeah, I would have liked to have gone really deep one or two times into pandemics. But as it turns out, virologists and epidemiologists are sort of camera shy, most of them, and don't want to be on podcasts and don't want to be on YouTube. They love talking about it, but then the other problem is that the amount of work you have to do to catch up to understand what they're even talking about is
Yeah.
often difficult, and most of them have a difficult time simplifying it. So had lots of interesting conversations with some of them privately, but I never did do a show. And I think that was the one thing that I left
Mm.
off regretting is that I didn't get to do a show. And then here we are. But I have gone back and I do occasionally look at the stats, and I did see a huge spike, um, right around when this started. And I was like, okay, well, all right. I guess people are still watching it, still listening to it, and finding value in it.
Yeah. Yeah. That was the same way when I did my EMS podcast. It's
Hmm.
like, it's still up there. You can still go find Confessions of an EMS Newbie.
Yeah.
And uh, I used to is I was looking at it. It's been like 8 years since that podcast, maybe 9, maybe 7 years since it went off. And as early as like last summer, I was getting emails from people starting EMS school
Hmm.
that were still going back and listening to it. That content is always there.
Hmm.
It's always there for people to use. And the interesting thing too is you occasionally see this on the internet, and I'm sure you'll find this. You'll understand exactly what I'm talking about, where they start telling you people who predicted this.
Oh
These
yeah.
people predicted this, and I'm like, you know what? People have been talking about pandemics for a decade at least, right? Like
Yeah, longer
and
than that.
every
Yeah.
and if you listen to them, right, the thing they're going to say is it's not if we're going to have one, it's when we're going to
Yeah.
have one. And now we're having one, and everybody can look back and say, "Oh, look, that guy predicted it." Oh, like yeah, everybody predicted it.
Yeah, that's there. Yeah, there's several things like this. So I had a so I started my first career was actually in architecture, and I had a job with a really big one of the, if not, I think they may be the largest power company at least in this in the U.S. And it was an interesting job, and one of the guys that was there, his entire job was to consider all of the facilities, all the power plants and everything, and how the architecture, how the actual facilities interplayed with security. Neat guy, totally bananas, like insane, spent way too much time thinking about some really, really, really dark stuff, and how to do it. Because that was, he first had to figure out, well, how do you blow up a building? How do you blow up a nuclear power plant? And then he'd have to figure out, how do we guard against that? And so I was the youngest there and always willing for a bananas conversation. So I would often get roped into his office to bounce ideas off of. And one day we were going through all kinds of crazy stuff and having a good time with it. And I thought it was fun and he thought it was fun. And then all of a sudden he got this far away look in his face and said, yeah, the only thing I can't figure out is one day somebody's going to figure out that jumbo jets have a lot of explosive power, and somebody's going to have the smarts to hijack one right as it takes off and ram it into a building. I can't figure out any way to safeguard against that, and I've thought about it for years. And I was like, wow, that's great, because this was back like we almost had no
Right.
security in airports anymore, which it's still, even with what we have today, it wouldn't have actually stopped what happened, what ended up happening. But I remember walking out, and then I was like, wow, that's a really dark thought and a really dark conversation we just had. Not unusual for that guy. But I was like, nobody's ever going to do that. And I think it was a year later. I think I was doing something at University of Houston, and I was walking out of a big lecture, and I remember my first thought was like, where, like, this was in the business department there, and it was like, usually the halls are at that time of day were packed. And I'd remembered seeing like a lot of people kind of quickly leaving the lecture, and I was like, well, I guess this is boring to them. I don't really know. Um, but then I looked up at the TV and saw the Twin Towers on fire. So, and it was about a year to the day. There are a lot of things that have been predicted by a lot of people, but then every talking head comes on TV and goes, well, nobody could have ever seen this. And nobody, and I listened to somebody the other night on the news say the same thing about what's happening now. And it's like, no, lots of people predicted this. Lots of people have been talking about it. It's just, it's not, it's either too scary for people, or it feels like it's too far fetched for people to happen. And so they just ignore it and don't pay attention to it. Or going back to, you don't know what you don't know, don't go seek out the information of what could go wrong. So,
Yeah, and the other thing is, it's easy when you're here to say, "Oh, we missed all these details."
mhm.
But it's not like someone didn't think that nobody had thought of the idea that we have an interconnected world and someone's going to get sick and that's going to be spread. Like everybody
Mhm.
knew that was going to happen.
Yeah.
And so there's that aspect, kind of like a big picture. But then when you're on the ground and it's happening, now you've got a whole bunch of details that you may or may not have thought about. I mean, like the truth is, in all of these disaster situations, there are entire people whose job, like you pointed out, is to think of crazy things that are going to happen and then try to come up with plans to deal with them. And there
Mhm.
are plans for pandemic. The CDC has lots of plans for it. FEMA and everybody else has plans for it. But when it happens, it's like, what's Einstein, not Einstein, Eisenhower's quote that no plan survives contact with the enemy.
Yeah.
Um, and, but by the same token, he said that no plan survives contact with the enemy, but planning is essential.
Absolutely.
And so it's one of those things where, things would have been a lot worse, right? More than likely, it would have just been a lot worse if nobody had any preparation. But
Yeah.
your preparation's never going to be 100%.
No, and it never can be. And that was also one of my pet peeves because when I was in the preparedness, there were a lot of people that were very certain they had done everything or done it all in the right way. And I'm just like, no. And I experienced that, living in Houston. There's hurricanes are
Hmm.
very frequent, and I still to this day, after many many decades or not many decades, but at least more than a decade of studying that topic in particular, not just hurricanes, but survival preparedness, and also growing up with hurricanes because I've lived here my whole life. Um, every hurricane I saw or learned something new, something weird, some little nugget, and it was like, oh, okay, that's different. Some new way that I wasn't as prepared as I thought, or even some new piece of data that was useful to know. One of the weirdest ones being I walked into a grocery store in a less than affluent part of town because I like to walk through the grocery stores during hurricanes to see what runs out because I'm weird and morbid. And it was funny because I saw all these people standing in front of this huge empty shelf of where water should have been. And they were standing around bemoaning the fact that there was no water, and yet right next to it was sparkling water. And I said something to somebody about it. I was like, that's water right there. It just has bubbles in it. That's all. And the person was like, oh crap, I never thought of that. But going back to the point again, like I've seen something every single time we go through a hurricane. I think the last hurricane where the water got kind of high up to our house, I was like, oh, maybe we need a Zodiac, like one of those big inflatable rafts. Like, maybe that's not such a bad idea. Like, maybe we need life vests in the house, which would have been never something I would have never thought of
How
really
about
seriously before.
sandbags?
Somebody sandbagged this house before, and it actually flooded into the house because of the sandbags. So
Ah.
I've avoided sandbags, but it's just because of there's some civil engineering that needs to happen to the landscaping around this house. But that's a weird, neither here nor there.
Yeah. And then, the other thing about disasters is that, you know what? They're called disasters for a reason.
Mm,
And like you're going to have a pandemic and people are going to die.
yeah.
That's kind of the definition, right? It's kind of like you're going to have um, a hurricane and structures are going to be destroyed and infrastructure is going to stop working like power. That's part of what it is.
Hmm.
All you're really trying to do is minimize that or prepare for it to happen.
Yeah.
You're not stopping it because you can't stop it. That's
No, all you can do is mitigate the damage and make it as little as possible. And then there's other things too. Like you can only prepare so much before you're preparing at the expense of everything else. I was having this because a good friend and who just thinks just in time inventory is the worst thing ever created, and it's absolutely horrible, and it's just the devil. And I understand his point because just in time inventory as a concept of where goods do not arrive to their final location to be sold until the moment or very close to the moment where they're needed. And so we're experiencing that with toilet paper, or most people are
mhm.
experiencing that with toilet paper. Not me, because I was prepared. Um,
Well, you had a problem with toilet
I had a
paper.
problem with toilet paper, which is a hysterical story that we were talking about recently. Maybe I'll share it in a minute for the audience if they think toilet paper 5-year supply of toilet paper is funny. My wife did not
So
think it
if
was
you
funny.
put in the comments that you want to know Aaron's toilet paper story
There you
or
go.
not.
Yes. So, but we were having a discussion about it, and he's like, "Well, it's terrible now. These people," he's like, "you and me, we got toilet paper, but the rest of these people, they can't wipe their butts." And I was just like, "Well," he's like, "See, just in time inventory is terrible." And I was like, this is a problem of just-in-time inventory, but there's other things
Yeah, there's a lot of other factors to the toilet paper
yeah,
problem.
there was a lot of other factors. I mean, it really didn't have that much to do with it. The small population that was good for TV and good for YouTube and good for social media, of Australians fighting over toilet paper in the aisles. That really wasn't it. There was an issue of like, these factories are finely tuned. And his point was, well, they shouldn't fine tune them so much. I mean, they should be able to handle like ups and downs like this. And I'm like, they could do that, but then your toilet paper would be twice the price. Or people could just store a little, not just store a week's worth of toilet paper.
Yeah. Well,
But these things are expensive to do. And you could wind up with a 5-year supply of toilet paper and try to figure out what in the world, where the hell you're going to put it in your house.
yeah.
So,
Yeah, and that's the unprecedentedness of this.
yeah.
In the toilet paper as a whole. I mean, there are like a lot of factors with toilet paper. One that I pointed out immediately was like, if you go to your grocery store, there is an aisle, and on that aisle, maybe half of that is toilet paper. Okay,
Yeah.
like there's the paper aisle, right? The other half's paper towels and Kleenex and everything. But half of that aisle is toilet paper, and this toilet paper comes in packages, and those packages say contain 12 to 24 to 48 rolls, right? How many units do you think is on that row?
Yeah.
It's a huge thing, so there's probably like 30, 40, maybe 50 units on this whole row.
Mm.
And that's fine because that's about what people use. But if suddenly now everybody's pooping at home, right?
Yeah.
And they all need it,
Yeah.
then you're going to run out just by raw numbers because like there's a volume issue to stocking.
Right. Yeah, and there was some yeah, so the TP thing is interesting because in general, the companies that make consumer toilet paper,
Hmm.
they don't make commercial toilet paper and vice versa. They're two completely different products. And commercial toilet paper is not designed to fit
Right.
on consumer because you as a company, and I mean, we had this issue when I had a company with a large showroom and had to supply toilet paper for employees and retail customers. Like, you go through a lot of it. And so, yeah, you don't want the good stuff because, well, people will just overuse it or roll it up and oddly put it in their pocket and take it home. The people take the weirdest stuff. Um,
Well,
and
nowadays people would totally do
well,
that.
yeah, they would totally do it. But those factories are fine-tuned to only because the supply is stable, so they only turn out so much in a day. So yeah, if all of a sudden you go home and you're doing all your business at home, well, you need consumer toilet paper, a lot more consumer toilet paper. Well, guess what? While everybody's crying that they don't have toilet paper, the guys that make commercial toilet paper are crying because they don't have any business.
Right,
So
because nobody's buying it because
yeah,
nobody's
nobody's
using it.
buying tree
Yeah,
bark on a roll right now. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. It is interesting. It's to me as a fascinating thing, and we'll kind of wrap it up after this. Is just watching, um, and this is like you were saying. Every time there's a hurricane, you would go different places. It's just watching to see
Mhm.
what breaks, right, and
Yeah.
what where the problems are. I was listening to a banker this week, and he was talking about people that uh, it was in the context of all these loan programs, but there were other. He was pointing out that there are people who are hurting that you would not expect to be,
Mm.
and the example he gave was doctors. And you
Mhm.
would think, oh, well, doctors shouldn't be hurting, right? Like, this is like the biggest medical thing ever. He goes, yeah, but if you're not that doctor, um, anything that's elective uh, is gone. Like,
Yeah.
nobody's doing elective surgery right now. Nobody's doing elective procedures at all.
Well, even dentistry. So, I mean, that's the
Yeah,
field that my wife is in, and she hasn't been to work in 4 weeks.
yeah,
Their entire practice is basically shut down. And had to lay off all of their employees or furlough all of their employees. Because that's a lot of really expensive staff to just stand around and do nothing
yeah,
because everybody
yeah,
said, "Hey, don't do random regular maintenance." Everybody's gonna have really nasty teeth after need
yeah.
haircuts and have really nasty teeth after
Real
this
your
is all
haircuts.
done.
That's the other thing. It's
Yeah.
funny to see how things like go in waves too.
Yeah.
I follow a lot of fashion YouTuber people, male fashion YouTuber people, and there's been it happened last week, really, a trend of videos on how to cut your hair at home, right? Because it's like, okay, we've been
Yeah.
locked up for 3 weeks. 3-4 weeks, hey, I need a haircut. But no, I can't have it. I don't have this problem
I
because I cut
just
my
yeah,
own hair.
I just had a friend trying to talk to me about that last night, tried to explain to me how to do it. And I was like, I don't care that much. I'll go see my barber after this is over. Although I did threaten with my wife that I was just going to shave my head, and she was like, "No, you can't do it." But I think it was more of an issue of me and anything to do with power tools of any kind. So
Yeah, yeah. You're
yeah,
off the power tools right now.
yeah, I'm not allowed to play with power tools. Anything that could have remote resemblance to a power tool, I'm not allowed to play with anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Aaron, is there somewhere you'd like to send people?
Um, no, I mean, if they want to, they can go check out the archives of the Rabbit Hole. It's still up. It's still on YouTube. It's still on iTunes and everywhere else. It's all there, free for people to consume and dive into. And we worked really hard sometimes too hard, on trying to make the audio quality of that show. Long before that was something that podcasters really focused on enough. That and video quality and everything else, and quality of information, and did my best to try to make it
Yeah.
an entertaining show and not so dark, because most of those shows tend to be very dark or very
Yeah, and you
yeah.
did a really good job of that. I was just thinking about I was about to make this plug about how if you want to hear Ron talk about medical stuff, you
Oh
could go
yeah.
find my episode on the rabbit hole about from the EMS perspective. But then my wife and I were also on there.
Hmm.
She did most of the talking about homeschooling.
Yeah.
And I think you could probably learn some stuff from that homeschooling episode now that everybody's suddenly doing it, right?
Yeah.
About having a plan and all kinds of things like that. So you guys could go look for that. That's in the rabbithole.com, right?
Yep.
Yep. So you guys can go check that out. Um, and let's see this button. Well, thank you for coming and watching the podcast and sticking around the whole time. If you'd like to know more about Distinctions for Life, you can go to distinctionsforlife.tv. That's the website. You can find out more there. I also have an email that comes out every Friday that has some interesting links in it, books I'm reading, tools I'm using, YouTube channels that I'm interested in. You can sign up for that and receive it. I also have a YouTube channel. So if you're watching this on YouTube, hit that subscribe button. You want to get, I come out with a new distinction every Sunday at 5 p.m. And I'm doing this show Tuesdays and Thursdays, at least through April, probably longer. We'll see how that goes. Reminds me, I want to get together with Aaron and talk about podcasting in the near future because Ron is not doing enough. And I want to do more for you people. It's funny. One of my proteges slash clients said, was commenting, and I said, well, I think I'm busier now than I was before because I've always worked at home. And now I've started doing so much more during this time, as well as trying to do all the stuff that you need to do that you haven't been doing as well. But anyway, so subscribe to the channel if you're on YouTube. If you are on Facebook, I also have a Distinctions for Life has a Facebook page, and you can like and follow it to get notified whenever we go live. And again, thank you so much for being here today and sticking around to the end. Have a good week. Oh, nope, not a good week because you should be back here on Thursday. Because on Thursday, we're going to have David Cranfill. He was on the live stream a few weeks ago. He's going to come back and he's going to talk about mindset and travel and the survival trap when it comes to having a business. And we're going to be doing that on Thursday at 2 p.m. Until then, bye.